Hello everyone, welcome to my last video of AMH 2010 and my first video of AMH 2020. AMH 2010 is U.S. History to 1877 and AMH 2020 is U.S. History since 1877. This is going to be a transitional video. We're going to be discussing the South during the Reconstruction era and in the Post-Reconstruction and Gilded Age period. We're going to be discussing roughly from the 1870s to the 1890s. This straddles the subject matter of both AMH 2010 and AMH 2020, so I'm going to be discussing the South in just one video. This is an outline of what we're going to be discussing in this lecture video. We're going to begin by discussing the Civil War very briefly. I've done videos on the U.S. Civil War before, but Reconstruction actually begins during the Civil War, as you're going to see. So I will be recapping the Civil War again. I'll be discussing some of the successes and some of the failures of Reconstruction, and then the legacy of Reconstruction, most notably important legislation like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and some very impactful landmark Supreme Court cases that are decided during the Reconstruction period. And these constitutional amendments and these Supreme Court cases are very important to know for the Florida civic literacy exam. So Florida college students will particularly want to pay attention to these sections of the video that discuss these very important laws and court cases. Also, I'll be discussing the end of Reconstruction, violence against Reconstruction, and the Tilden Compromise, which brought Reconstruction to an end in 1877. Lastly, I want to emphasize that Reconstruction is not just something that's happening in the South. America as a nation is being redefined in this period. Reconstruction is happening out west, and it's happening in the North as well. The second portion of this video will discuss life in the South after Reconstruction and what is often called the New South, or really it's the Gilded Age South. It's a period in which the South is industrializing, its economy is changing and evolving, and many of its social systems are changing as well. But there's also some very important continuities with the past in the New South. The New South is not entirely new, as you're going to see. Topics like the economy, industrialization of the South, resource extraction, new industries that were not around in the South before the Civil War are going to be considered. And of course, we're going to discuss the people of the South, both African Americans and white Americans. How do they respond to the social change of the Reconstruction period and the post-Reconstruction New South? We'll talk about challenges African Americans face, the Jim Crow laws, violence that African Americans face, like lynching, and then we'll discuss white Americans' responses to social change, particularly things like the lost cause. And the image on this slide is of very important abolitionist and civil rights leader Frederick Douglass, along with several African American congressmen that were elected during the Reconstruction period. Unfortunately, these men were voted out of office after Reconstruction came to an end. To begin, though, I'll offer a very brief recap of the U.S. Civil War. The U.S. Civil War, also known as the War Between the States, the War for the Union, the War of the Rebellion, the War of Northern Aggression if you're from the South. There's many names to this conflict. It was fought from 1861 to 1865 between the United States, or the Union, and the Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. You can see the Confederate States in red on this map, and you can see the Union States in blue. You'll also notice that there are states that have red and blue stripes. These are called the border states. They had slavery, yet they remained in the Union, and they are Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and eventually West Virginia will break away from the Confederate state of Virginia and rejoin the Union as the state of West Virginia. The war was fought immediately and primarily because the southern states, especially the Deep South states, were dissatisfied with the election of Abraham Lincoln, who you can see on the left in this slide. He was elected in 1860 with a plurality of the vote, and they were also very dissatisfied with the rise of the Republican Party, which had started a couple of years earlier in 1854. Lincoln was the first Republican president. Lincoln and the Republicans had promised not to end slavery where it presently existed. Lincoln made that very clear, but they did want to pass legislation to prevent the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. You can see them in gray on this map. They were in the process of becoming states during this period, most notably the state of Kansas, which you see that it's a blue Union state on this map. The map is from a little bit later. In fact, Lincoln was not even on the ballot in most of the southern states and counties. Um, he was rejected by white southern voters because of his promise to prevent the expansion of slavery. Preventing the expansion of slavery was seen as tantamount to attacking slavery or curtailing slavery where it already existed. Generally speaking, the upper South states were more reluctant to leave the Union, whereas the deep South states like South Carolina, they were the first to leave the Union. In fact, South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union. South Carolina was also the site of the first battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Fort Sumter. And the war again was fought from April of 1861 to April of 1865. Now, the war was not initially waged to end slavery. Lincoln and the Republicans had talked about preventing the spread of slavery, not about ending it where it presently existed. But things changed with time, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation that was released initially in 1862, but then went into effect in 1863, which made the Civil War a war to end slavery. And I talk more about what the Emancipation Proclamation is, its effects, why it was written, and why it was released in my AMH 2010 course, my U.S. since, or U.S. to 1877 class. Here are some images, scenes from the American Civil War. At the top left, you see an African American unit, or USCT, U.S. Colored Troops Unit, as they were called. The Union Army began to arm African Americans to fight in the Civil War, particularly after 1862 and 1863. Support for the war was decreasing amongst white people in the Union, but African Americans recognized that this war was an opportunity to end slavery, even before the Emancipation Proclamation was released. To the center, you see the battle between the Merrimack and the Monitor, or the Virginia and the Monitor. This was two very famous ironclad ships. The Union built the Monitor, which you can see on the right, and the Confederates built the Virginia, which they actually built out of a captured Union ship called the Merrimack on the left. Ironclad naval warfare changed naval combat forever. It brought in a new age of basically the beginning of battleships. They replaced the older wooden sailing and steamships of previous decades. Next, we see three Confederate prisoners captured at the Battle of Gettysburg. This is one of the most iconic images from the American Civil War. This is another very famous painting from the Battle of Gettysburg of Pickett's charge. The last day of fighting saw Confederate forces attack the heavily fortified Union line in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This was a major defeat for the Confederates, and it was considered by many to be a turning point in the Civil War. After that, it was clear that the Confederacy was going to lose the conflict, at least to historians looking at the Civil War years later. And then at the bottom right-hand side of this page is the CSS Hunley, or CSS HL Hunley, technically. It was a Confederate submarine. It was crank-powered, turned by its crew. It was not a electric or diesel-powered submarine. That technology had not been refined and developed yet. But this vessel was used to try to break the Union blockade of the port of Charleston, South Carolina. The Hunley did manage to sink a Union sailing ship, but it sunk in the process, taking its entire crew to a watery grave. But another historic technological development that came out of the Civil War. Here are some statistics about the U.S. Civil War. Again, fought from April of 61 to April of 65. There were well over 600,000 military casualties, and if you add in civilian casualties, there were at least 750,000 deaths, as you can see. This is a really traumatic event in American history. hundreds of thousands of people dying. Think about it today, or rather, think about it in the 1860s, America had about 30 million residents or citizens and people living here. There are about 330 million people today. This would be like if there were a conflict that took place in America in which 7.5 million people died. And really, the modern field of statistics as we know it develops during the American Civil War as government officials, physicians, aid workers are trying to calculate how many people have died, the death toll, how many people are wounded, trying to help people have the bodies of their loved ones be repatriated and returned. It's a massive moment in American history, a traumatic moment, and it also helps to develop the modern field of statistics as well. Here are some scenes of the destruction of the Civil War. Major southern cities like Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and Atlanta, Georgia, a major Confederate rail hub, were devastated by the conflict. Artillery shells that would blast the city, fires that would start. As Confederate forces would evacuate a city, particularly Atlanta, they would destroy supplies that they did not want to fall into Union hands. And when Union forces entered Confederate cities, they would also destroy any supplies that they could not take for themselves and use for their own armies to keep them from potentially falling into Confederate hands in the future. And recent scholarship has really shown just how destructive the Civil War could be. They may not have had the technology that 20th century armies had. They may not have had aircraft that could drop bombs. They may not have had nuclear weapons. They may not have had napalm and things like that. But these armies, when deployed in either hostile territory or even in their own territory, can be very destructive. Taking food and other supplies from the countryside, often in some cases leaving the civilian population with very little or nothing to survive themselves, which is again why you have a high civilian death toll in the Civil War. But you can see images of the destruction of these cities. You can see images of the skeletal remains of the dead recovered from battlefields. This image is from the Battle of Cold Harbor in Virginia, which was a very short but very bloody battle in the Civil War. So think about all of the destruction and the loss of life that I've described before. There are good things that come out of the Civil War. We have constitutional amendments, namely the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, was passed in the final months of the Civil War. And then, of course, emancipation for African Americans, who became known as freedmen, Freedmen. They gained their freedom because of the Civil War, as you can see from these images from Harper's Weekly. And with freedom would come the opportunity to have togetherness with your family. Families were not going to be broken up anymore after slavery had ended, after the Civil War had ended. That was the hope anyway. And then African Americans would have equal political rights, or at least black men would have equal political rights. They would be able to cast their votes, have the right to vote. Again, that was the hope, that was the expectation. This is an interesting map. It was created by a YouTuber. You can see credit for that in the bottom left-hand corner of the map. We talk about Reconstruction. We talk about the destruction of the South. It is true that the major southern cities were devastated by the Civil War. It is also true that some of the South's best farmland, its most agriculturally and economically productive regions, were almost picked clean during the Civil War, not only by the invading Union Army, but by the Confederate Army as well, that was deployed in those territories. But what you'll see is that if you look at it on a map, in terms of just raw land space, only a small portion of the South was truly occupied by the Union Army, really felt the full sting of war. And you can see that here in this map in light blue. These are areas that the Union had a significant presence in 1865 as the war came to an end. So yes, they have occupied major cities like Atlanta, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, the capital, Columbia, South Carolina, the capital of South Carolina. Charleston was actually not the capital of South Carolina. Many people forget this. Nashville was captured very early in the Civil War. In fact, most of Tennessee was captured relatively early in the Civil War. New Orleans, major Confederate city, the largest of all the southern cities, was captured as well. But you look at all this land here in dark red where there was not a significant permanent Union presence, especially in places like Texas. There was a little bit of a Union presence in the western panhandle, and then actually down on the southern border with Mexico. But for the most part, Texas felt very little of the Civil War compared to a state like Virginia or a state like Georgia. If you were to keep track of this territory mathematically, you'd find that less than 25% of Southern territory had really been occupied by the Union during the Civil War. But as I said, the South's most agriculturally and industrially productive and most populous regions were heavily damaged or destroyed in the conflict. And again, images from Atlanta, Georgia, as railroads were destroyed by Sherman's troops. That was part of the strategy, and then destruction of Richmond, the Confederate capital. The South's economy and infrastructure are going to have to be rebuilt, along with its socio-political systems. Now that African Americans have been freed, black people were a large part of the Southern population. They now have freedom. They're going to have to be brought into politics, into society in new ways. Things are going to be reconstructed, not only socially and politically, but economically as well. And the U.S. Army will play a major role in Reconstruction, protecting African American rights, as well as the rights of white people that supported the Republican Party, who were white Republicans in the South were a very small minority at this point. And they're going to have to combat various Southern white supremacist gangs and paramilitaries, some of which had significant membership of Confederate veterans. And this is, of course, an extremely difficult mission. The South is over 750,000 square miles. It's about 5.5 million white people and about 3.5 million black people. And as time goes on, the troops deployed for the Union or U.S. Army are going to decrease. They're going to be drawn down. There's 1 million Union troops in the South in 1865. By 1866, there's only 57,000. That number is going to decrease as time goes on. It's not nearly enough troops deployed in the South to have a really effective, fully effective Reconstruction. There's post-war demobilization going on. There's endeavors to cut budgets. And of course, there's Democratic Party opposition to Reconstruction, not only in the South, but in the North as well. And there's constitutional issues that come with having the U.S. Army deployed in American territory, which the South is part of the United States again. And of course, troops are needed in other parts of the country. They're needed particularly out west to deal with the ongoing wars against Native Americans, and especially in the mid-1870s on, troops are going to be needed in the North as well to deal with labor unrest. So it's an extremely difficult mission reconstructing the South. I think when people condemn Reconstruction, they say it was a failure. They don't realize what a high bar the Reconstruction supporters had to meet to really be fully successful. I think they often don't think about these military concerns and these economic concerns. I don't think the U.S. government had the resources or the means to do what they did during the occupation of Japan after World War II, or the occupation of West Germany after World War II, or to have something like the Marshall Plan. I mean, there were organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau, but nothing like what you would see in the 20th century. And you would have needed a lot more spending, a lot more of a government presence, and of course a lot more troops, I think, to really make the Reconstruction of the South as successful as the Reconstruction of Japan and West Germany, how successful they were after World War II. Historians generally define Reconstruction into a series of phases, usually 3 phases: wartime Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, and then congressional or radical Reconstruction. And the dates that they give sometimes are a little bit different from one historian to the next. I define wartime Reconstruction as running from 1861 to 1865. I would say more often than not, historians say that wartime Reconstruction began in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect in 1863. I argue, however, that the Union Army was taking steps as early as 1861 to redefine society and politics and the economy in the South. This is something I talk about in my AMH 2010 course. Presidential Reconstruction is from 1865 to 1868. It's primarily, you could say, overseen by U.S. President Andrew Johnson. He's setting the tone. Johnson replaced Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson, however, was not a believer in a intensive reconstruction of the South. In some ways, he was very similar to Lincoln. He believed in taking a lighter hand with the South, but Johnson believed in taking a lighter approach with the South for somewhat different reasons than Lincoln did. Lincoln was a very balanced person. He could be very magnanimous to people that supported him. He could be more forceful with those that opposed him. Johnson was a much more irascible person, easily angered, held grudges very easily, and while he was a white Southerner from Tennessee and a Democrat, he didn't like the upper class of the South very much. He had very little interest in helping African Americans either, and he was constantly going against the radical Republicans in Congress, and eventually he's going to be impeached. He tried to remove the Secretary of War, or what we would call the Secretary of Defense nowadays. The radical Republicans use this as an opportunity or a pretext to impeach Johnson, and Johnson was impeached in the House of Representatives, but he was not convicted in the Senate. He was very narrowly acquitted in the Senate. But after Johnson's impeachment, he does not seek re-election or election, and that ushers in the congressional or radical phase of Reconstruction, which lasts from 1868 to 1877. In this final phase, the radical Republicans are in charge of Congress, and they're working with a new president, Ulysses S. Grant, former commander of all of the Union armies, and Grant is much more supportive of Reconstruction than Johnson was. And this is when you see that there's more progress being made in Reconstruction, but in the end, Reconstruction ends in 1877. And it even ends a little bit earlier in some of the other southern states. Basically, Reconstruction ends when the last U.S. Army or Union troops are withdrawn from the South. To highlight that Reconstruction begins during the American Civil War, really as early as 1861, I just want to highlight a few examples. Wartime Reconstruction was overseen by President Abraham Lincoln, who wanted to take a magnanimous approach towards white Southerners. He believed that white Southerners were U.S. citizens of rebellion and therefore were entitled to certain rights. So he wanted to bring the southern states back into the Union as quickly as possible with as little destruction and bloodshed as possible, even as Lincoln over time did expand the reason that the Union continued to fight the Civil War, including to end slavery. And the Civil War, as mentioned before, officially became a war to end slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862 and 1863, and this was confirmed with the 13th Amendment, which was passed and ratified in the final days of the Civil War. Other examples of wartime Reconstruction: the redefining of race relations, the dissolution of slavery, the transformation of Southern society and American society as a whole, can be seen in things like Union General Benjamin Butler's contraband at Fortress Monroe in Virginia. General Butler elected to keep African American escaped slaves from being returned to their slave owners once they had reached Union lines. He argued that they were contraband of war and that if they were returned to slave owners, they would continue to support the rebelling Confederate economy, and therefore they should be given their freedom within Union lines. Another example from 1861 is the Port Royal experiment of the South Carolina Sea Islands. The South Carolina Sea Islands were black majority islands that were the site of plantations, and the white slave owners who owned the land, they fled the arrival of Union forces in November of 1861. The African American population stayed behind. They were given their freedom, they were given education, and they were given an opportunity to work for themselves and have free labor for the first time in their lives. And it was seen as an experiment for what to do with African American freedmen, free people, once the Union had abolished slavery. Of course, not everyone at the time in 1861 understood that the Civil War would be a war to end slavery yet at this point. In 1862, you have the capture of two very important southern cities, Nashville, the capital of Tennessee, and New Orleans. New Orleans being the biggest of all the southern cities. The U.S. government, the Union, experimented with Reconstruction policies in both of these cities and really across western and middle Tennessee. The Union occupied most of Tennessee fairly early in the Civil War. African Americans were also armed during the Civil War, both African Americans from the South and Northern African Americans. They joined units called the USCT, or the U.S. Colored Troops in the language of the day. The most famous of all of the USCT units was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And then, as far as what to do with the white southern population of the South, Lincoln advocated for a magnanimous approach. He advocated for something called the 10% plan. Once 10% of a state's population had taken an oath of loyalty to the Union, that state could begin the process of rejoining the Union and having voting rights and political rights. Lincoln sparred with the radical Republicans in Congress who wanted to take a stronger, harsher stance against the South. They instead advocated for something called the Ironclad Oath, in which white Southerners would have to take an oath that they had never supported the Confederacy in order for their states to rejoin the Union and for them to regain their voting rights. And the images on this slide, the top image is of the Port Royal experiment in South Carolina, and then the bottom image is the 54th Massachusetts in combat. As I mentioned before, the U.S. Army, or the Union Army, plays a major role in Reconstruction, not only in occupying the South during and after the Civil War and in protecting African Americans from various white supremacist paramilitaries and gangs, but even in some cases in setting the tone of Reconstruction and offering suggestions for how Reconstruction should be done. A good example of this is Special Field Order number 15. This was a development by General William Tecumseh Sherman, who you can see on the far left-hand side of this slide here. You can see a commemorative plaque here in Georgia for the special order. As Sherman reached Savannah, Georgia, on the coast of Georgia, around Christmas of 1864, a few months before the war ended, he met with African American leaders in Georgia who proposed breaking up eastern coastal plantations in Georgia and even in a little bit to the north and the south as well, dividing them into 40-acre plots and issuing these plots to African American former slave families and then giving them an old army mule as well. The war was coming to an end. The U.S. Army, or the Union Army, no longer needed these mules to pull artillery caissons and things that could be given to African American families to pull their plows, as you can see on the image on the right-hand side. The plan was not followed through with, primarily because the war ended in April of 1865. Doing this sort of thing would have been possible, I think, in wartime, but doing it after war and peacetime would lead to some very serious legal questions as plantation owners' property, as their land is being divided up, being taken from them. It's easier to defend that sort of thing during war when those territories are in active rebellion versus once they've surrendered and come back into the Union. In the end, this attempt at what you might call land reform or land expropriation didn't really go anywhere. And we actually have land reform in America. We have things like the Homestead Act, which I think you could consider to be a form of land reform. But on the whole, you don't see as much land reform in American history as you do in other countries. And you might call the Homestead Act a form of land expropriation as well. And the Homestead Act will be discussed in a later video about the American West. So what is the Southern response to Reconstruction? Or what is the white Southern response to Reconstruction? Well, they're very resistant to Reconstruction. They had lost the war, but they really did not want things to change at all, if possible. The southern states were beginning to accept that slavery had come to an end, but they wanted to keep as many of slavery's white supremacist institutions in place as possible, particularly some of the discriminatory laws that had been around at the time of slavery. These laws were called black codes. They're going to be changed and adapted over time in the Reconstruction and the Post-Reconstruction era. So there was also violent resistance to Reconstruction as well. The KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, it was founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest, a very important Confederate commander of cavalry. He'd also been a slave trader as well before the Civil War. It was founded in late 1865 in Tennessee. And the KKK was basically a terrorist organization that functioned as really as the paramilitary wing for the Southern Democratic Party. Their goal was to intimidate African Americans and white Republicans, even some white Southerners who do not support the Democrats, to keep them from voting, to keep them from being politically active. That way, the white Southern Democrats, who are largely of the planter elite class, that way they can regain power in the South. And there were other armed groups besides the KKK. The KKK are just the most famous because they were around for a lot longer. They go underground and they have resurgences in the 20th century. And of course, they're famous for their costumes, their hoods. They're famous for some of their rituals, for the ways in which they committed violence and the ways in which they intimidated their opponents. And of course, they will attack African Americans as well as some white people that supported Reconstruction. Here are some images of the KKK and of their actions. You can see they wore hoods to disguise their identities. The pointed hood is actually a reference to Spanish Catholic traditions. Spanish Catholic worshippers would wear pointed hoods like this at times of confession to symbolize their penitence before God. The point was actually supposed to be almost like a dunce cap in a way, but Forrest and the early members of the KKK adopted a lot of very spiritual imagery to make the Klan seem more intimidating and to frighten their opponents, to frighten African Americans, to frighten whites who were who they were against. It's ironic that they would actually use some of this Catholic religious imagery, considering that the KKK would become an anti-Catholic organization in the 20th century. But they also used elements of the minstrel folk tradition as well. The minstrel folk tradition was African American musical styles and cultural motifs that were adopted, often in a racist manner, by white performers. And the KKK members believed that adopting these minstrel traditions, these religious Catholic traditions, they could make their organization more intimidating, more frightening, and give it more cohesion as well. The KKK was also a secret society with various ranks and members. In antebellum America, that is America before the Civil War, secret societies like the Freemasons had been very, very popular. So it's one part secret society, one part terrorist organization that's committing violence for political ends, one part gang because it's insular and their members are committing crimes, not just lynchings and violence, but other types of crimes as well, robberies and things like that. And then, of course, the final part is it's a hate group as well that's targeting African Americans, and then it's targeting white people that support the Republican Party. You can see that here, bottom right-hand side of the slide. Here is a KKK on a donkey, the Democratic Party, and they've hung or lynched carpetbaggers from Ohio. You can see here the bag they're holding. The term carpetbagger comes from this period. the carpet bag, made out of an old piece of carpet. It was the rolling suitcase, you might say, of the 1860s and 1870s, and white Northerners would move into the South with these carpet bags. Some of them were there to engage in what you might call disaster capitalism, buying up cheap Southern land to build a sawmill or something like that, which of course the local population was not happy about. Others were there to help African Americans to start schools, to offer job training, and white Southerners didn't like that either. They didn't want anyone to empower African Americans. So these out-of-state Northern carpetbaggers, regardless of what their motivations were, they were often persona non grata in the South, and sometimes they were the targets of violence from the KKK. And this final image here shows President Johnson allegedly colluding with ex-Confederates to stop Reconstruction, to get in the way of Reconstruction, to be an obstructionist against Reconstruction. Again, here are some other pictures of the KKK in their hoods. Here is an early KKK disguise. You can see the pointed hood is designed to be intimidating, and it does come from that Spanish confessional religious tradition. There were other violent gangs and groups besides the KKK. You had the White League. You had another group called the Red Shirts. As the KKK loses numbers, other white supremacist groups will pop up in its stead, almost like a game of whack-a-mole, you might say. Here are some important pieces of legislation that were passed during the Reconstruction era that are going to be relevant even beyond the 1870s. The 13th Amendment, 1865. Abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for crimes, and you have the 1866 Civil Rights Act as well. So the 13th Amendment, it allows for involuntary servitude if it's a part of a prison sentence. That's going to be an issue later on with the convict labor system, but the 13th Amendment does end what we would call chattel slavery. People being bought and sold because they are property, their families being broken up. So it is progress. It is a step in the right direction, even if later actors will find ways to exploit the law and skirt around its provisions, or at least only follow some of its provisions. And the 1866 Civil Rights Act was passed to give citizenship and due process to African American freedmen if they were born in the United States. This is to help former slaves get their citizen rights. It's vetoed by President Johnson. As I said, he was a obstructionist against Reconstruction during the presidential Reconstruction period. His veto was overridden by Congress. And the thing is, it's very difficult to enforce this 1866 Civil Rights Act with the KKK and other paramilitaries active in the South. You have the 1867 and 1868 Reconstruction Acts. These actually will divide the South into a series of military districts. This is because the Southern states had as they came back into the Union, they may have abolished slavery in their state constitutions, but they did allow for things like black codes, discriminatory laws that denied African Americans the full rights of freedom. These black codes will eventually evolve into the Jim Crow laws. There were also other restrictions, namely that former Confederate military officers and politicians could not run for office, because what would happen is these southern states, they would vote for the same people who had led those southern states out of the Union to begin with. And then in order to vote, in order to have your own political rights, white Southerners have to take an oath of loyalty as well, that they had not supported the Confederacy. Again, these Reconstruction Acts, these are much stronger and much more forceful than what you were seeing in 1865 and 1866. And then there's the 14th Amendment in 1868. This extends citizenship and equal protection for freedmen, for former African American slaves. Since the 1860s, it has been interpreted to mean birthright citizenship, not including Native Americans. There were some legal cases in the 1880s that led it to be interpreted the plain language that meant that anyone born in the United States would be a U.S. citizen. That's a controversial subject. It's as of 2025, the Supreme Court is hearing cases related to birthright citizenship. There was a senator named Jacob Howard for the Republican Party out of Michigan who was a big supporter of the 14th Amendment. He argued that the birthright citizenship component was more restricted and was more limited to African American former slaves, not necessarily to other groups, immigrants, for example. But again, there's a lot of debate. America's system is based on common law, which means that we interpret our laws based on legal cases, and there were legal cases that took a very broad interpretation of the 14th Amendment, meaning birthright citizenship for everyone born in the U.S. There's going to be differences of opinion about what the 14th Amendment meant specifically. What was its original intention? What is its plain language? How has American society changed since 1868? But this is part of how American law works, are these very lively debates. I mentioned some of these things before, but just to kind of recap and summarize, the former Confederate states, in order to come back into the Union and have representation in Congress, they had to amend their constitutions to ban slavery, and that was something that they did, but they would allow for black codes. These are discriminatory laws that went against African Americans that made it very difficult for them to enjoy the full rights of free people and of U.S. citizens. They included things like not being able to move freely to find better work. They included things like not being able to serve on juries, not being able to own certain types of firearms, to be able to defend themselves, and they basically kept African Americans in a subordinate position to whites to try to keep as many of the elements of slavery, many of the strictures of slavery, without having slavery itself. One of the reasons I think that the anti-vagrancy laws, they were called, the laws that restricted freedom of movement for African Americans, why they were passed was it wasn't just economics to keep African Americans from finding better, high-paying jobs, having control of their labor. It was about keeping African Americans from moving around in the South after the Civil War. Remember, many families had been broken up during the time of slavery, and one of the first things that African Americans, as freed people, that they wanted to do was to go find lost family members that had been sold, in some cases to other states. So there was a lot of African American migration, both from one state to another, and even within the various former Southern states. They're trying to reunite with family members that have been separated from them. And the radical Republicans in Congress opposed these black codes. They opposed the return of former Confederates to power in the South, and they will pass the Reconstruction Acts in 1867 and again in 1868 to really give the U.S. military more power to enforce the federal law and to keep the people who had basically caused the Civil War from regaining power. So barring them from being in office, and then of course dividing the South into these military districts, which would make it easier for the U.S. Army to enforce the law to protect African Americans and white Republicans from groups like the KKK, for example. And this is really the U.S. military's first long-term occupation security force duty in hostile territory that was not Native American territory. The U.S. had briefly occupied some territory during the U.S.-Mexican War in the 1840s, but the amount of territory they were occupying was much smaller. It was small portions of Mexico that they were occupying rather than an entire region like you're seeing here. The U.S.-Mexican War is a subject of great interest to me. I wrote my dissertation on it, so if I can always talk about the U.S.-Mexican War, it's always a good thing. There were 5 military governors, former U.S. Army or Union Army officers that ruled over these five districts as well, and they're going to help enforce the law. They're going to work alongside the Freedmen's Bureau that was passed in 1865, and then they're going to enforce the Reconstruction Acts and even the 13th and 14th Amendments, and eventually the 15th Amendment as well of 1870. And they're going to fight against various white supremacist gangs like the KKK. the Red Shirts and the White League. I mentioned these gangs before. And really, there's low-level guerrilla warfare in large parts of the South. In many ways, the Civil War does not fully end in 1865. It goes on as a guerrilla warfare or insurgency, counterinsurgency conflict into the 1870s. And as I mentioned, as time goes on, the taste for Reconstruction in the North comes to an end. The Reconstruction work is expensive. There's a push to cut budgets after the Civil War. Those troops in the U.S. Army, they're needed elsewhere. They're needed out west to fight against Native Americans. They're needed in the North to deal with labor unrest. And of course, there's constitutional issues that come with occupying the United States, occupying U.S. territory. Remember, presidential Reconstruction ends in 1868 as Andrew Johnson has had his ears pinned back after being impeached. It's really fully going to come to an end with the 1868 presidential election and the election of Ulysses S. Grant, who you see in the left-hand or right-hand side of this slide. The 1868 presidential election, it's the first presidential election since the Civil War, and it's the first presidential election in which black men, legally speaking, are able to vote nationwide in both the North and in the South. There are some exceptions, of course. There are states that still are not fully in the Union yet, Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia. And of course, there is illegal violence to keep African Americans from voting in the South. But the U.S. Army still has a presence in the South and is able to provide some protection to African Americans. And the voter turnout is actually very high in this election, 80% voter turnout, much higher than the 55 to 60% turnout we get today. This is even with some former Confederates still not being able to vote. They have not taken loyalty oaths yet. Certain former Confederates also are barred from running for office as well. So it's not just about who you vote, it's about who you vote for in American politics. And there's a larger proportion of African Americans that will vote in this election than in future elections as white Southern Democrats begin to retake control of the South and Reconstruction comes to an end. The Republicans, they choose Grant. He's a war hero from the Civil War. His message, his campaign promises were to continue Reconstruction forcefully if necessary. As time goes on, Grant's stance on Reconstruction will change. He will moderate and eventually take a much more reconciliationist approach. Grant had a lot of sympathy for African American former slaves, but as a veteran of the Civil War, he actually had a lot of sympathy for former Confederates as well, which a lot of people often are not aware of. The Democrats, they choose Horatio Seymour of New York, a Northern Democrat governor of New York. They need to choose someone who's not tied to the South, who could be accused of being a traitor. They do try to balance their ticket, though, with a Union general, F.P. Blair. And Johnson, of course, his name was mud in the country, so they didn't choose Johnson as their guy to run for president in '68. And to sort of balance things out as well on the Republican side, Grant was a supporter of Reconstruction. They choose Schuyler Colfax of Indiana as their vice president. And the Democrats ran on an overtly anti-black message, that they were the party of the white man and that the Republican Party was the party of the black man. And the Republicans, of course, they promised Reconstruction, and they really rely on Grant's popularity as the highest-ranking Union general. And it's the recipe they need to win the election in 1868, and they win very commandingly, as you can see from this slide. I mentioned some of these things before, so primarily focus on the images here. The KKK was started in 1865, but they're largely going to be defeated in the early 1870s thanks to policies that were supported by President Ulysses S. Grant. These are the Enforcement Acts of 1870 to 1871. The enforcement acts, they allowed for state militias to suppress Klan activity, along with the U.S. Army that was still left in the South as well. A large portion of these state militiamen actually were black. There had been efforts to keep former Confederates from joining and taking control of these state militias. You're going to see what happens to some of these militias later on because of their membership. And many of the African Americans who were in these militias had seen combat during the Civil War. So Grant also sent additional federal troops to the South, particularly to districts and places where the KKK was very strong, like South Carolina, which was District 2 of Reconstruction. And the enforcement acts initially were successful. The Klan was suppressed and largely defeated in the 1870s. The problem is, as the KKK dissolves, other paramilitaries will replace it, like the Red Shirts, for example, or the White League. Reconstruction was a political and economic venture, as it was also a military venture. It was a social venture as well, and the U.S. government was very involved in helping African Americans get back on their feet and in trying to rebuild parts of the South that had been heavily damaged and devastated by the Civil War. You have organizations like the Southern Claims Commission that covered damages that were incurred during the Civil War, and you have the Freedmen's Bureau as well, which was specifically designed to help African Americans. And many parallels have been drawn between the Freedmen's Bureau in the 1860s and 1870s and later programs of the New Deal in the 1930s. The Freedmen's Bureau was initially called the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, and it was staffed partially by the War Department, but it worked with a lot of civilian workers as well. And they provided educational, financial, and legal assistance to African Americans. But white people loyal to the Union could also get Freedmen's Bureau assistance as well. And the military personnel in the Bureau, they would protect Freedmen's Bureau agents. They would enforce federal laws, and they were in some cases, arrested and put on trial in Southern courts, where they would face white Southern juries that, of course, were very biased against them. African Americans were also largely barred from serving on juries, or at least the white Southerners attempted to keep African Americans off of juries, along with keeping them from voting and things like that politically. And these court cases were another reason why the South was divided into these military districts. This would allow the U.S. Army and the Freedmen's Bureau to act with more latitude and not have to worry about being put before Southern civil courts. You could argue that this violation of the state court system, a trial by jury in the area where the crime had allegedly been committed, this is a violation of the Constitution, but you also would argue that perhaps it was a necessary provision as well. And again, in American history, we always debate the meaning of the Constitution, when are constitutional rights being restricted? Is it a necessary thing? These are important discussions that certainly come up on things like the Florida Civic Literacy exam, but they're also useful for historians as well to consider. This is Ulysses S. Grant as president. He won his first election in 1868, and then again he won in 1872. Here are images of the KKK and other groups like the White League conspiring together against African Americans, the freed people. And this is a scene from the Colfax Massacre of 1873, a really violent battle in Louisiana in which an African American militia was attacked and had very high casualties after being attacked by a white supremacist paramilitary group. Here are some really important pieces of legislation that are developed during what is called Congressional Reconstruction and the Grant presidency. Remember, Congressional Reconstruction is from 1868 to 1877, or the end of Reconstruction, and it's Congress that is primarily driving Reconstruction in this period, but they have a very supportive president in Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was supportive, whereas his predecessor, Andrew Johnson, was an obstructionist. So you have the Enforcement Acts, which were supported by President Grant. They suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which allows Habeas corpus means you cannot be held in jail without cause. Habeas corpus means whereas the body, there has to be a reason to hold someone in jail, which you can't always find that evidence sometimes. But these are efforts that are being made to control and defeat groups like the KKK. And of course, state militias are federalized by the enforcement acts. Sometimes the enforcement acts are brought up in the present day when the National Guard is being discussed. The National Guard and its relationship to the executive branch of the president. And then, of course, the court system is going to be used by the enforcement acts as well. This is being done to combat these paramilitaries in the South, like the KKK, and to protect African Americans, particularly their right to vote. So these are the enforcement acts. The 15th Amendment is passed in 1870. This gives the right to vote for all citizens, regardless of if they had not been previously enslaved. So the fact that you were a slave previously could not keep you from being allowed to vote, is what the 15th Amendment says. And the 15th Amendment does not specifically mention women or people under the age of 21. The 19th Amendment is going to give women the right to vote, and the 26th Amendment is going to give people under the age of 21 the right to vote. And those laws, those amendments were passed in 1920 and 1971, respectively. And then there's the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It's sometimes known as the Force Act. It allows, or rather mandates, that the federal government must act to protect civil rights, particularly against segregation of public spaces and African Americans not being allowed onto juries. It's very important to have people from the area be on the jury, not just one group of people. And the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was largely struck down by the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case, which will be discussed soon. And some of the text of the 1875 Civil Rights Act, it's going to be used about 90 years later to write the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Moving on into the 1872 presidential election, Grant's primary slogan in this election was, "Let us have peace." He's promising peace in the South. That will mean taking a less aggressive stance with white Southerners, but at the same time continuing to protect African American rights and continuing to attempt to pacify the region. Basically, we're going to finish Reconstruction, but we're also going to show charity to former Confederates. That's sort of the spirit of Grant's campaign, if I were to describe it in a few words. Here's where things get interesting. The Democrats, again, are struggling after the Civil War. They're the party of secession. That really does not help them, especially in the North. So what the Democrats do is they unite with an anti-Grant Republican, or a liberal Republican, he's called. His name is Horace Greeley. He was a very famous Chicago newspaper editor. Certainly, he would have been a household name in 1870s America. He had been critical of Grant. He'd been critical of Reconstruction. He's called a liberal Republican because he's a classical liberal, along the lines of sort of Enlightenment thinkers who supported limited government, rule by consent of the governed, and they saw Reconstruction as being illiberal. It's a different kind of liberalism than, or a different definition of liberalism than, say, modern 21st century definitions of liberalism. So the Democrats unite with the liberal Republicans. They choose a newspaper editor rather than a traditional politician to be their candidate. In the end, the Republican Party under Grant, the main Republican Party, wins. Grant still has popularity as a former Union general, and it's hard to gather enough Democrats to vote for a guy who doesn't have a lot of experience in their political party. And to make things even more confusing, Horace Greeley actually dies after the election, but before after the vote has taken place, but before the Electoral College election happens. So it's a rather unusual election in American history. But Grant wins his second term. African Americans also were, in some cases, still able to vote in this election too. When they're able to vote, they vote for the Republican Party, as you can see from the map in the bottom right-hand corner. In many parts of the South, African Americans were the majority. In some southern states like South Carolina, they were the majority. There were more African Americans than there were whites. And in certain districts and regions in the South, black people were a majority as well in places like sort of the central Alabama Black Belt, the Mississippi River Valley in Mississippi. These areas are going to vote for the Republicans because African Americans can still vote in this period. Grant had some pretty significant headwinds, though, even though he did win the election. There was a lot of corruption in the Grant administration. Grant, historians argue, was not someone who trusted politicians very much, so he would give out positions to his friends and to his family, believing that that was a more transparent thing to do. It actually was less transparent. It led to things like the Credit Mobilier scandal. That was a railroad scandal. There was other scandals that involved the Grant administration, particularly out west related to aid that was supposed to go to Native Americans. There was a lot of corruption in the Grant administration, and there was a lot of corruption in the Freedmen's Bureau as well. Whenever you have a big bureaucratic organization, there's going to be a lot of spending. There's going to be a lot of what we might call pay for play today. And that was something that the liberal Republicans like Greeley and the Democrats, of course, were going to attack Grant for, and not without reason. But in the end, Grant is able to win the 72 election. So in Grant's second term, he has to take a somewhat lighter hand with Reconstruction. The American people are beginning to lose interest in Reconstruction. Rather, white Americans are losing interest in Reconstruction, especially in the North. The American economy is entering a very serious economic recession in 1873. It's called the Panic of 1873. It was driven by basically a railroad bubble, kind of like we had the 2008, 2009 financial crisis bubble. This bubble was caused by railroads, so the spending that was required on Reconstruction, it was not as tenable in a period of serious economic problems. Additionally, again, the U.S. Army is needed in other parts of the country. They're needed out west to fight Native Americans. They're needed in the north to deal with labor unrest in the 1870s. So Reconstruction begins to fade in the 1870s in Grant's second term, as well as the Enforcement Acts. And you can really see this with the Colfax Massacre of 1873. This takes place in Colfax Parish in Louisiana. They call counties parishes in Louisiana. It's a legacy of the French tradition, the French civil law tradition in Louisiana. Louisiana had a very large African American population, and race relations in Louisiana were more nuanced, you might say, than in other parts of the South because of the area's French and Spanish traditions, its larger populations of people of color. There were African Americans that had moved up in Louisiana society in a way that would not have been possible in other parts of the South. So there was a black militia that was guarding Republican Party officials in a courthouse in the Colfax Parish. They were besieged by paramilitary gangs, gangs like the Red Shirts, the White League, organizations like this that were opposed to Reconstruction. The militia surrendered or attempted to surrender, but they were attacked by these paramilitaries, and possibly as many as 153 people were killed, including civilians that were not really even part of this black militia. Reinforcements did arrive to try to relieve this militia. They were actually led by former Confederate General James Longstreet, who you can see at left on this slide. Longstreet was a white Southerner, and he was a former Confederate, but he supported Reconstruction in the Republican Party, which earned him a lot of ire and hatred even from other white Southerners. They used to call white Southerners who supported Reconstruction, they used to call them scalawags. It sounds like a term from pirates, but it actually means like an old beat-up horse or cow. So it's not a nice term for a scalawag like James Longstreet. But they didn't get there in time to stop the massacre. And as I said, the Union Army is being drawn down throughout this period. By 1873, there are perhaps 8,000 U.S. Army troops in the South. This money is needed elsewhere because of the economic panic. The Army is needed elsewhere, and of course, Democrats in both the South and the North, they oppose funding the military because it's being used in the South to support things they don't want. And everyday white Americans are concerned about having the U.S. Army be involved in law enforcement. There's constitutional issues that come up here. There were some important cases that came out of Louisiana, not only out of the Colfax Massacre of 1873, but also something called the slaughterhouse cases. The U.S. government, even after passing the 14th Amendment, it still struggled to protect U.S. citizens, especially African Americans, civil rights when those civil rights were in conflict with state laws. And you can see this with the what's called the Cruikshank versus USA case, and then the slaughterhouse cases. I'll do the slaughterhouse cases first because those decisions were made first. Um, in New Orleans, there were attempts to basically clean up the city, to regulate the slaughtering or slaughterhouse and butchering industry. Because what would happen is in New Orleans they would butcher livestock, the offal and the intestines and skin and any kind of animal waste would just basically be thrown out, and it was very unsanitary. It could lead to sicknesses and diseases. So regulations were passed that animals would have to be slaughtered outside of the city in specially made slaughterhouses. The thing is, these regulations, they do protect consumers, they keep the city cleaner, but there was a monopoly basically given to one company that ran these slaughterhouses. The local butchers of New Orleans sued against the state, and this case ultimately went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided that it could not weigh in on a state issue like this. This issue of slaughterhouses and regulations had to be handled by the states, not by the federal government. So this case is not directly related to Reconstruction, but it sets a judicial precedent that limits the power of the U.S. government to do things like enforcing Reconstruction laws. So the slaughterhouse cases, it's about slaughterhouses, but it does kind of tie the hands of the U.S. government. That leads to the Cruikshank v. United States case of 1876. And in this case, some of the people that were involved in the Colfax Massacre were put on trial, and while the state of Louisiana condemned to convict them, the U.S. government, via the Supreme Court, basically declined to get involved in these cases to enforce federal law. So these two Supreme Court cases, one which is directly related to Reconstruction, Cruikshank, the other, which is not related to Reconstruction, Slaughterhouse, they set a judicial precedent that really weakens the power of the federal government to intervene against state laws that might be violating the rights of citizens. As an aside, these are the red shirts that I mentioned before. They're called that because they wore what are called rifle shirts that were red. These were the shirts that you'd wear when you went hunting or when you went shooting for recreational purposes, and they were red, which is why they're called the red shirts. And a lot of these red shirts would have been former Confederate veterans who would have seen action during the Civil War. So Reconstruction is coming to an end. During Grant's second term, Grant may have made or helped to make some significant progress during his first term with the Enforcement Acts, which largely broke up the KKK, but other organizations began to replace the KKK, like the red shirts that I showed on a previous slide, like the groups that took part in the Colfax Massacre of 1873. And as I said, many Americans, white Americans outside of the South, they were tired of Reconstruction. It was expensive. There were constitutional issues at play. And the average white American, even in the North, didn't really care very much about what happened to black people in the South. And the Supreme Court, in the Slaughterhouse case of 73 and in the Cruikshank case of 76, had basically declared that the U.S. government could not intervene in these state cases where citizens' citizenship rights had been threatened by state laws. And you're going to see that by the 1876 election, ending Reconstruction is going to be a major political promise and a major campaign issue, especially for the Democratic Party. There's going to be certain deals that are going to be made during and after the 76 election that are going to bring Reconstruction to an end once and for all. This is the 1876 election. Here it is on a map at the top left corner of this slide. This election saw Rutherford B. Hayes of the Republicans run against Samuel Tilden of the Democrats. Hayes was a former Union Army veteran, Tilden was a former Northern New York Democrat, and Tilden was promising an end to Reconstruction if he became president. Hayes even was as well, but he was not as opposed to Reconstruction as the Democrats were. So what happened was this. It was a very close election. Samuel Tilden was actually winning. The Democrats were winning in the popular vote, and it was very, very close in the Electoral College. And what was going to happen was it was going to come down to 3 states: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. These states had the last federal troops, the last U.S. Army troops left in the South, and they were there still trying to uphold Reconstruction policies and protect African Americans, particularly their voting rights. In the areas where the U.S. Army had been withdrawn, there were widespread reports of voter fraud, voter suppression, African Americans not being allowed to vote, corruption, things of that nature. In this period, there are no secret ballots. There are no identification requirements to vote. Basically, in order to vote, you have to get a ballot, usually from the local newspaper. You take it to the local political boss, who is going to work for whatever is the stronger party in the area. In this case, in the South, Democratic Party. He knows you, you know him. He'll let you put your ballot into the ballot box, and he might give you a glass of whiskey or some food after you vote. Oftentimes these votes are taking place in a local saloon or at a local tavern. There's a lot of fraternization that's going on. The thing is, African Americans, if they go to try to vote, they might be stopped from voting. Or, as this comic here on the bottom right shows, they might be intimidating into voting for a candidate that they don't support. The caption is, of course he wants to vote the Democratic ticket. They're showing 2 kind of white league type ruffians holding pistols to an African American man's face before he goes to vote. If you look closely, you could actually see 2 men on horseback dragging another black man to the polls. So either black people are not being allowed to vote, intimidated against voting, or maybe they're being forced to vote in a way that they don't want to. So there's good reason not to trust the election returns that are coming out of many of these southern states. So the Democrats are threatening a civil war, Tilden or blood, if they don't win the election. And they would argue that they deserve to win because they're winning in the popular vote. Republican and Democratic Party leaders will get together in smoke-filled rooms. They will negotiate. Even the Supreme Court will get involved. And in the end, the states of Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana are going to be given to the Republicans. The Republicans will win this election with the Electoral College, not with the popular vote. And Hayes will be president. In exchange, Hayes will withdraw the last U.S. Army troops from the South. Reconstruction will be completely over by 1877. Again, the election takes place in 76. They're negotiating into early 1877 when Hayes then is inaugurated as president. Here is a political cartoon from the period. It's from Puck magazine, a really famous American satirical magazine. They're always interesting to take a look at. Some of their cartoons have what we would call casual racism in them, so be aware of that. But on the left, you see the Grant presidency coming to an end, carpetbaggers, U.S. troops, the South being crushed by Grant's policies, allegedly. It's a very anti-Grant cartoon. Here on the right, they show Hayes's let him alone policy. The sword has been beaten into a plowshare, a reference to the Bible. White Southerners are now allowed to recontrol the South, and they're showing a South that's prosperous with cotton bales being loaded onto steamships. They show supposedly peaceful relations between blacks and whites in the South. It's a very pro-Hayes, very anti-Grant comic strip. But now you're going to see in the coming slides whether this comic strip is actually true or not. The final thing I'll say about Reconstruction before I move on to the Post-Reconstruction or Gilded Age era South is that Reconstruction is most closely and commonly associated with the South in the popular historical imagination, the popular historical memory. We think of all of the things I've mentioned before: the occupation of the South, the attempts to bring political equality to African Americans, violence by the KKK and other groups, But Reconstruction and the redefining of American social systems, economic systems, etc., it's not just something that's happening in the South. Events that are happening in the South are connected to other parts of the country, and things that are happening in other parts of the country are connected to the South as well. And this slide gives some examples. In the 1870s, the Gilded Age is beginning. Labor unrest in the North and even in parts of the Upper South are increasing. And there's a push to end Reconstruction in the South so that the Reconstruction of the North, the redefining of the Northern economy, can continue. Labor unrest can be suppressed, and industrial capitalism can continue to grow and take hold in the northern United States and really throughout the U.S. On the left side of the slide, it's a collage of images from railroad strikes, the most notable of which in this period was the 1877 West Virginia railroad strike, which I'll talk about in a later video. And that strike of railroad workers, it actually spread across the country, and there were multiple railroads that saw strikes during this period. But the U.S. Army is going to be used to suppress the 1877 railroad strike, which leads to the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act. Remember, the Posse Comitatus Act was not just about taking away the powers of the U.S. Army in the South to prevent future attempts at Reconstruction after 1877. It was also about restricting the power of the U.S. Army for law enforcement in northern labor unrest and labor disputes and protests and riots and things of that nature. As I mentioned, there was a odd political alliance between white Southern Democrats and between white Northern labor interests in the Democratic Party. And Reconstruction is happening out in the West as well. The West is being conquered, integrated. It's being settled by white Americans. Native Americans are being forced off of their lands. Their reservations are being shrunk. Treaties are being violated. And the idea is that if there are too many troops in the South being deployed in the South, then fewer troops can be sent to the West to defeat these Native American powers and to further the conquest and integration of the West. So what is happening in the North and what is happening in the West, these are factors, motivating factors for why Reconstruction ends when it does and why it's not picked up again in the South later in the 19th century. And the last thing I'll mention before moving on to post-Reconstruction Southern politics is the alliance you see between the white Southern Democrats and between the white Northern labor interests in the Democratic Party. Some scholars have argued that this is part of what is called America's bourgeois revolution. It's an economic term. It comes actually from Marxism, especially the bourgeoisie, the upper class, the middle class, versus the proletariat, the working class that provide the labor. Scholars have argued that America is transitioning from an agricultural republic, an agrarian republic, into an urban industrial state in the late 1800s during the Reconstruction era and during the Gilded Age. And northern business interests, railroad interests, which are fairly close and tied to the Republican Party, they were trying to create voter bases but also labor bases in the South, expanding railroads, expanding industry, moving towards more of a wage labor and industrial economy that produces things like steel, things like oil, things like coal. There's still agriculture, but we're going to become more of a inorganic economy that produces raw materials that are not renewable, as opposed to growable, renewable agricultural products, which is what America's main exports had been before the Gilded Age. So it's not only is it about changing the political systems, changing the economic systems, changing the social systems, there are very strange but interesting political alliances that emerge in the Reconstruction era. And it's part of what some historians call America's attempted bourgeois or bourgeoisie revolution, as we're going from an agrarian republic where slavery was providing a lot of the labor, especially on plantations, to more of a wage-based urban industrial nation state. where there are more manufacturing workers, there are more wage laborers. There is still farming and agriculture, but industrial interests are going to be driving the economy. But with this final note about the nationwide elements of Reconstruction, we're going to move on to discuss post-Reconstruction Southern politics. So what's going on in the South? After the 1876 election, after the Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel Tilden compromise that allows Hayes to become president, what's happening after the last U.S. troops are withdrawn from the South? Well, white Southern Democrats, who are called Redeemers, they begin to take control of local and state politics. They suppress African Americans' right to vote. They get themselves elected. They and their constituents will vote out some of the African American congressmen and senators that have been elected during Reconstruction, and they're building the solid South, a South that votes entirely for the Democratic Party, in which ideally all of the white population is going to vote for the Democrats, and the Republican Party will not be able to win elections in the South anymore, and African Americans, their voting rights and their political rights will be suppressed. Once they get into power, they begin to pass a series of discriminatory laws designed to take away African Americans' civil rights, to make them as much like they were in slavery without actually being enslaved. These involve mass disenfranchisement and segregation of African Americans. They're called the Jim Crow laws. They have some similarities, but also some differences with the old black codes. In particular, segregation was not a major feature of the black codes, but it is going to be a major feature of the Jim Crow laws. And the term Jim Crow, it comes from a song called Jump Jim Crow, which was a racist song about how African Americans were not hard workers. This is what was called a minstrel song. It's a parody song performed by a white person who's in blackface, painted to look like a black person. It's a racist musical style and a racist song, so it's befitting that it's a name for a racist series of laws. And the federal government is not going to stop the passage of the Jim Crow laws. Legal cases like the Slaughterhouse case of 1873, the Cruikshank v. USA case of 1876, previously discussed, and then the later case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which I'll go over later. They're going to uphold the Redeemers' policies, and they're going to kind of tie the hands of the U.S. government. The U.S. government is not going to be able to protect U.S. citizens' laws and rights when those rights are being curtailed by state governments. Even if the laws that the states are passing are clearly unconstitutional, which the Jim Crow laws certainly were a violation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Certainly the 14th and 15th Amendments. And the Jim Crow laws, they included provisions like anti-vagrancy laws that make it very difficult for African Americans to move freely without carrying a pass to prove that they are employed. If you can't prove your employment, you can be arrested and convicted and sentenced to imprisonment. You cannot serve on a jury, which means that if you are put on trial, your chances of getting a fair trial as a black person are much lower. You cannot vote. There's various laws that are designed to keep African Americans from voting, and even in some cases to keep poor white people from voting too. And there's laws against firearm ownership. There's laws against interracial marriages. And these laws, as I mentioned, they do often have a negative effect on poor whites as well, who in many cases actually have more in common with African Americans than they do with the white planter elite that is controlling politics in the South. There's an effort to prevent African Americans and poor whites from coming together politically. Basically, instead, they're going to provide labor to the white upper class. They're going to work as sharecroppers. They're going to work in factories. They're going to work in various types of employment rather than unite together against the white upper class. Lastly, and this is something I'll unpack a bit more later, the Jim Crow laws are not just laws on the books. They're social customs that are white supremacist in nature. They can include things like if a black person and a white person are walking along the sidewalk, the black person will dismount from the sidewalk, possibly walking in the muddy street to allow the white person to pass. If a black person and a white person are both checking out at the general store, paying for their merchandise, the white person can cut the black person in line. Things like you cannot have black people and white people be too close together, particularly black men and white women. For example, in some cases this is a social custom. In some cases it's an actual law. A black black male hairdresser cannot have white female clients, for example. A black man cannot light a cigarette for a white woman. That brings them into too close of contact with each other. There's social customs here in addition to actual laws on the books. And even in some ways, it controls language, how people talk to each other. It's acceptable for white people to refer to a black person, even a black man, as a boy when addressing him. And you might call an older black person, if you don't call him a boy, you might call him uncle, which is seen as being racist. Although in some parts of the South, any older person, white or black, could be called your uncle, even if they're not related to you. So the term uncle doesn't necessarily have to be a racist one. So now I want to talk a bit more about labor systems in the post-Civil War and post-Reconstruction South. And I'll begin by talking about sharecropping, because sharecropping was a major, and I would argue essential, labor system in the South, especially for plantation agriculture, to make plantation agriculture work after slavery had been abolished. So what is sharecropping? Put simply, sharecropping is a system of tenant farmers who pay their rent for their land and pay any debts they might have using a share of their crop. Hence, it's called sharecropping. And interest rates and how much debt has to be repaid and when, those arrangements are going to be made between the landowner, the sharecropper, and then any kind of merchants or business owners that the sharecropper buys things from during the year. There's some things to know about the sharecropping system. In actuality, the majority of sharecroppers were not African American. The majority were actually white, because there were more white people in the South than there were black people in the South. There were some black majority states, and there were certainly black majority counties and regions, but on the whole, there were more white people in the South than black people. Sharecropping, though, has been thought of as being a black institution because when you look at black farmers and agricultural workers in the South in the post-Civil War and post-Reconstruction period, black farmers are much more likely to be non-landholding. That is, they're more likely to be sharecroppers and tenant farmers than their white counterparts who have more opportunities to own the land that they're working. That doesn't mean, though, that land ownership was impossible for African American farmers, but it was more difficult, and you're going to see why in a moment. What would happen is, over time, some black farmers, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, they did make enough money to buy their own land, something that they could not have done when they were slaves. But still, it's probably 10 to 15%, possibly a quarter of black farmers actually owned the land they worked on. So the majority were not landowners. They were sharecroppers or tenant farmers. And here's how the sharecropping system worked. A farmer would make an arrangement to set up his farmstead on the plantation owner's land. It could be a white farmer, or it could be a black farmer, maybe even a former slave of that slave owner. They will agree to the terms, and the farmer will purchase goods at the general store, flour to feed his family because he's growing cotton, farming equipment, clothing, things of that nature. And if there's a good harvest, then he'll sell his cotton, and he'll give a share of the cotton to, the landowner and to the store owner, and the debts will be paid, and he will save some money to potentially buy some land, possibly even the land that he's currently working on the farmstead. If it's a bad harvest, or if cotton prices fall, or if there is a weevil infestation. Weevils were absolutely devastating to cotton agriculture, or if the soil just wears out over time because the crops are not being rotated. The sharecropper could have a very poor harvest and could not pay back his debts. He will owe money to the landowner, owe money to the general store owner, and they can actually take out what are called crop liens, liens, against the sharecropper, meaning that future cotton crops or future produce from the farmstead can be withheld and taken by the debtors, or rather the creditors from the debtor, the farmer. As I said, the terms of this relationship, the interest rates are going to be decided by the landowner, and the farmer may not have many choices. The farmer needs to make money. African American agricultural workers, being constrained by the Jim Crow laws, by anti-vagrancy laws, if the terms they're offered by the landowner are bad, high interest rates, short periods of repayment, they can be stuck in debt to the landowner and to the store owner, and they can't go anywhere until those debts have been paid, or they could face other legal consequences if those debts are paid. So because of that, while some African Americans are able to purchase land, they're going to, on the whole, have a more difficult time buying land for themselves to work than a white farmer or a white sharecropper would. A white sharecropper would have an easier time getting out of a bad agreement and getting into a better one. So this illustration here breaks down how sharecropping works, as I described. Here, this is an image of enslaved workers harvesting cotton. There is a continuity, as I've mentioned before, between sharecropping and slavery. Granted, sharecroppers are able to keep a part of the cotton for themselves, or a part of the crop for themselves. They are receiving compensation for their labor, perhaps on unfair terms, but that's something that enslaved people could not do. If you're looking at photographs from this period, you're trying to figure out if this is a picture of slaves or a picture of free black people, you can often look at the clothing that's worn by the people in the picture. Typically, enslaved people, the clothing they wore was often torn from whippings and from beatings. The cloth they were given was often of very cheap quality. The slave owners don't want to spend more than they have to. But once they become free people, one of the first things that many African American freedmen do is they try to buy better, nicer clothing to kind of cast off not only the shackles of slavery, but the raiment or the clothing of slavery. It's a symbolic thing. So you can sort of class these photos based on what the participants are wearing. And you can also do this too because fashion changes. You can look at an image and date it that way as well as classifying as an image of sharecroppers or of enslaved people. And as you can see in this image of sharecroppers, there's white sharecroppers collecting cotton, and there are black sharecroppers as well. In this map here, it shows where sharecropping is the most common by county. You'll notice the area in blue is where there's the most sharecropping by percentage, and the area in red, there's the least sharecropping. So kind of the fringes of the South, the upper South, parts of Florida way down south where there's less development and settlement, there's less sharecropping. But in what is called the Black Belt of the Deep South, that is from South Carolina through all the way to Mississippi, this region here, this is called the Black Belt. It has very rich black soil, perfect for growing cotton and for setting up plantations. It's also where the largest black, especially enslaved population was, because that's where the most plantations were. And even to this day, the Black Belt is where the majority of African Americans live if they live in the South. But there's other industries in the South besides sharecropping, as you're going to see. So what other industries are developing in the post-Reconstruction South? Well, the South is becoming a lot more industrial. What is happening in the South is connected to the Gilded Age. It's taking place in the northern United States. The North is becoming more industrial during the Gilded Age from the 1870s through the 1890s, and so is the South. This period is often called the New South as well. The term New South was popularized by Henry Grady, a journalist from the Atlanta Constitution. You can see him on the right-hand side of this slide. And the New South economy has some important changes, but some commonalities as well with the Old South economy, the Old South society. And when I say the Old South, I mean the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War, pre-abolition of slavery South. Antebellum means pre-war, and in American history, antebellum means pre-Civil War. So the pillars of the New South economy are plantation agriculture joined with heavy industry, factories, and resource extraction. The Old South, antebellum South economy was very agrarian, based around plantations, but also some smaller farms. There's still going to be agrarianism, there's still going to be farming, but the American economy is changing, including the Southern economy. We're moving away from a organic, agrarian, what you might call a renewable economy, where crops are grown, and if it's done properly, these crops are renewable. You can keep growing cotton, you can keep growing corn as long as the soil is well fertilized and the natural environmental resources are not squandered. But now we're getting into an inorganic economy that's based on non-renewable resources, things like coal, things like steel, even oil in places like Texas. And these resources will eventually run out. So the raw materials that are being extracted here, we do have agricultural products like cotton from places like Alabama. We have indigo from places like coastal South Carolina. We have sugar from places like Louisiana. And we have timber now. The timber industry really grows after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era and beyond, as a lot of farmland is abandoned, as plantations are abandoned. Some of that land is bought up for pennies on the dollar by northern, often carpetbagger investors, who then turn it into forestry areas. They turn it into logging operations, and the wood that is produced in these logging operations is taken to sawmills, where it can be used then to rebuild damaged southern cities, and it can also be sent north, where it can be used to fuel the growing urbanization in the north. Northern cities are increasing in size as southern cities are being rebuilt during this period. Tobacco, of course, is a agricultural product that's grown in the upper South, places like Virginia and Kentucky, for example. Turpentine is a product that's made from pine logs, specifically from pine rosin or pine sap. It's a very important industrial product that has a lot of applications in the Gilded Age. And then later you see things like steel by the 1890s, and in places like Texas, oil by the turn of the century. Steel is produced using iron, which can be mined out of parts of the South, and also coal, which can be mined from parts of the South. An important steel center was actually at Birmingham, Alabama. It's very interesting. When you go to Birmingham, Alabama, it feels a lot like a Rust Belt city, even though it's in the South, because of the steel industry. And new industrial centers develop in the South. Places like Birmingham, Alabama. Other cities become more industrial as they're rebuilt. Places like Atlanta, Georgia are a good example. The South is being modernized. Railroads are being rebuilt after they'd been destroyed in the Civil War. And the goal is to make the Southern economy much more diverse. It has more factories, bigger factories. It's going to be less dependent on the North. The antebellum Southern economy was very dependent on the North for they needed places to process the cotton that was grown in the South. There were factories in the South, but they were smaller and less efficient. A lot of that cotton was shipped to the North. It was also shipped to Europe, too, especially to Great Britain. And the fact that the Southern economy was so cotton dependent but not processing the cotton themselves, that helped to hasten the Civil War, helped to make the Civil War happen. And the labor system in the New South, it's going to consist of poor whites and African Americans, free African Americans. Poor whites and free blacks are going to work as sharecroppers on farms and plantations, and they're going to work as laborers in factories and in lumber yards and in forests and mines. And these free labor systems are going to be supplemented by convict workers or convict laborers. These are people that are sentenced to imprisonment, and while they are prisoners, they are going to do various types of labor. Technically, this is not a violation of the 13th Amendment, this forced labor by convicts, because the 13th Amendment allows for forced labor as part of a punishment for a crime. but you'll see the crimes that people are convicted for and the labor they're sent to do. Some people would argue that essentially the 13th Amendment is being the spirit of the 13th Amendment is not being followed, even if the letter of the 13th Amendment is being followed. And now I'll show some images related to the New South, industrialization and agriculture and resource extraction. And here are some images related to the New South. You have factories and cotton plantations. The South had factories in the antebellum period, but scholars have estimated that for every one factory in the South, there were 10 factories in the North. So again, the North was much, much more industrial than the South. Also, generally, Southern factories were smaller and less efficient than the Northern factories. Here is first carload of steel made in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was a steel town. When you go to Birmingham today in the 2020s, it really feels a lot like driving through a Midwestern Rust Belt town, but you're actually in the South. Here are workers collecting pine bark to expose the sap, which can then be turned into turpentine and all kinds of other useful chemicals. Again, it's a more industrial economic system. And this is a railroad bridge built in the South. According to the image, circa 1911. Notice what is hanging from the bridge. This is the scene of a lynching. It looks like between a woman and a man. So this image here, I think, really encapsulates the New South. You have new technologies, you have more industry, as seen by this railroad bridge, but race relations have, in many ways, continued as they were before the Civil War, as you can see from the people that have been murdered in the image. I wanted to bring this up before, but it makes more sense to do so now. In popular memory of the post-Reconstruction South, of the so-called New South, some people make the mistake of thinking that things were not really any better for freedmen, for free African Americans in the South after Reconstruction and after the Civil War than they were in antebellum times, before the Civil War when slavery was still legal. And this simply is not true. While there were commonalities in power structures, racist power structures that existed and continued after the Civil War and beyond into the Reconstruction era and afterwards, African Americans still had more opportunities as free people, even with the Jim Crow laws, even with segregation, even with discrimination, even with unfair labor systems like sharecropping, which some people might consider sharecropping to be a form of debt slavery. At the same time, though, there are opportunities to advance economically in sharecropping if the harvests are good, if the terms offered by the landowner are fair. And another example of how sharecropping is better than how agriculture, plantation agriculture, was done during slavery, that can be seen here on this map. And this map, I've seen it in many textbooks over the years that I've been teaching and studying history. It's of the Barrow Plantation in Oglethorpe County, Virginia. Oglethorpe County is in northeastern Virginia, kind of close to the South Carolina-Georgia border, to give you an idea of what we're talking about in the South. And the 1860 map is on the left. It shows the plantation when slavery was still legal and in effect. The enslaved population all live close together under very close, strict supervision from the plantation owner, from the slave owner, and from his overseers. You can see their quarters here behind the main house, or the big house, as many enslaved people called it. The idea was plantation owners wanted to have their property close to them so they could be served and so they could observe their labor and make sure no one was planning an escape or an uprising. Many slave owners were very, very paranoid people about what were slaves going to do, or they would say things, what is my black family going to do? You're calling them family, but you're holding them in bondage, and they obviously don't want to be enslaved. Anyway, though, after the Civil War ended, slave quarters would be abandoned as African Americans left to try to reconstitute their families. Other black families might move in to the property, making sharecropping agreements with the slave owner. And in some cases, former slaves who had worked this specific plantation, they might make a sharecropping agreement as well. Once they'd made that sharecropping agreement, the individual plots of land or farmsteads would be created. You can see one here, another one here. And this gives the freedmen, the sharecroppers, much more privacy, much more freedom to do with their farmsteads what they want. Now, they don't own the land, but they grow the cotton that they're going to pay the landowner and the storekeepers and things with, but then they might also grow vegetables and things like that for their own family's use as well. And this strengthens the black family, it gives more privacy, and it's definitely an improvement over all of these slave quarters and people living right on top of each other. This is an improvement, it's a better system. One last thing I'll mention is, while some plantations, they're able to continue through sharecropping after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, other plantations were not able to do so, and many big plantation houses, big houses, were abandoned. And this is actually in part where the American haunted house trope comes from. Many cultures have a haunted house trope, but a lot of the haunted house tropes that we have were based on abandoned plantation houses that the owners could no longer maintain because they'd lost their enslaved labor force, and so they had no way to keep up this big house anymore. Really, they built these big houses not just for their own comfort and use, but they built them to kind of show their wealth and almost to intimidate their neighbors. But now with slavery gone, that's going to be a much more difficult thing to do for many plantation owners. Some, though, of course, were able to continue to maintain their houses through the sharecropping system. And this recreated map, I found it made by an independent scholar named James Essen. His website is here down below if you want to check it out. He did some research, and he speculates this plantation is no longer in operation and that now the land is being used for logging, which in many cases abandoned plantations, they were turned into logging operations and forestry operations. And now we'll continue our general discussion of the post-Reconstruction South. There were attempts to connect white Southerners of the working classes, of the middle classes, with African Americans. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful in the South. This is called populism. Populism was a very important political movement in the late 1800s in America. You see populism today as well. It has some similarities to the populism of the past and some differences. People like William Jennings Bryan were important populist politicians. Bryan actually eventually became the Democratic Party's chosen candidate in the 1900 election. He lost. There were other candidates like Tom Watson as well. Tom Watson was from Georgia, and he attempted to galvanize poor whites and African Americans together into the populist movement. And unfortunately, populism largely failed in the South. There was some success for populist candidates on the local level and on the state level, but on the national level, they had a hard time uniting poor whites and African Americans together, largely because African Americans, for the most part, cannot vote in the South. You're going after a voting group that cannot vote. And then poor whites still preferred to side with people of their race rather than people who had more class similarities to them. So populism doesn't really take off in the South on a large, like, multi-state or interstate level. They do have some gains on the smaller intra-state and local level within the various states. But again, the efforts at galvanization of classes fail in the South. Instead, people sort of side based on race. This is the convict labor system, or images related to it. The convict labor system actually existed throughout the country, but it's most associated with the South. And what would happen is this. Remember, there are a lot of laws, discriminatory laws against African Americans. They're designed to make it difficult for African Americans to advance themselves in the South. Anti-vagrancy laws, laws against voting, laws against serving on juries. If you cannot prove that you are gainfully employed, you can be arrested. And if you're put on trial, most likely you're going to face an all-white jury. That's going to make it harder for you to get a fair trial. And if you're convicted, you'll be sent to prison. And while you're in prison, you can be made to do forced labor during your sentence. Um, what would happen with the convict labor system is this. The state could send convicts out to go work on state projects, roads, bridges, any kind of public works that needed to be done in the state. And that was one way things were done in the South. What also would happen is convict laborers could be basically leased out to private companies. A logging company, a railroad company could come to the local prison. The prisons are overseen by the county sheriffs, and they need revenue to fund their prison. So one of the ways they get their revenue is by leasing out these prisoners, and they can be sent out to dig railroad tunnels. They can be sent out to cut down trees for a logging company. This is generally male prisoners, especially black male prisoners, but there were some white men as well who could be in the convict labor system. In fact, when they worked on chain gangs outside of the prison, there were actually laws that said that, particularly in Mississippi, that you cannot have white and black prisoners chained together. So the Jim Crow laws are even active in prison. The prisons are segregated as well. There were some black women that were also in chain gangs and in convict labor too, as you can see on this slide. This is African American female prisoners collecting their mail. This is black men working on building a railroad in North Carolina. And this is an image of black men working in the woods to cut down trees. This image, I believe, is from Florida, and based on my work on this, what they would do in Florida is they would load black men onto these carriages, these sort of prison cars. They would tow these carriages out to the woods. They would work all day long cutting down trees, and then in the evening, the guards would load the men onto the carriages and lock them up in the swamps, in the woods for the night. Being bitten by mosquitoes, perhaps snakes crawling into this car. Really, not a pleasant experience at all if you're one of these convict laborers. And there are two caveats I will say. Again, convict labor existed outside of the South. It existed in northern states as well. There were white convict laborers in addition to black convict laborers, although they're often separated. And the final caveat is, over time, this leasing of black laborers to private companies, or rather prisoners to private companies, this becomes less common. Instead, they'll work on state projects. And in state projects, they'll be on what are called state farms, where they could be farming or they could be doing other work for the state. The conditions are a little bit better. The treatment is a little bit better. It still can be very harsh treatment, and some would argue that it's basically skirting around or exploiting the 13th Amendment's provisions, because the 13th Amendment does allow for labor during involuntary labor during prison. So this is the convict labor system. By the way, if you've seen the Coen Brothers movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's set in 1930s Mississippi. There's a reason that the three white protagonists are chained separately. It's because in states like Mississippi, it was the law that white prisoners and black prisoners had to be on separate chain gangs. And of course, in the opening scene of the movie, the three white prisoners chained by themselves, they run away and escape together. As one is studying the post-Reconstruction South, the New South, the Gilded Age South, it's easy to become very pessimistic about what's going on in the South during this period. African Americans are supposed to be free, yet they are being discriminated against, yet their voting rights are being taken away, their civil rights are being curtailed, they're facing violence from lynchings, extrajudicial violence. They're facing a government that is not giving them fair treatment in court. It's sentencing them to prison. But there are some gains as well. I don't want people to get the idea that things were just as bad or worse in the post-Reconstruction South than they were during slavery. For example, there are new jobs available, particularly wage-based jobs. Wage labor in factories is steadier work than working on a plantation. If you're working on a plantation in agriculture, you can lose your crops. If there's a bad season, then you could be very deeply in debt and be trapped. But as a wage laborer, you have a bit more flexibility. A new sector of labor that emerged in this period was work on the railroads in the Reconstruction era and beyond. Railroads were being built in the South. This provided very good labor, particularly for African Americans, because the wages generally were good working for the railroad. And also, as a railroad worker, you can travel for your work. You are gainfully employed as you're moving with the railroad to the next length of track that's being built. And this allows black people to see different parts of the South, to visit the cities, and to have community with other African Americans, and to find better places to live and better opportunities. And you really see this in the story of John Henry, who is a semi-legendary African American railroad worker who is based on a real person that was a railroad worker in West Virginia, and of course is a big part of African American culture today, and a big part of kind of American folk culture writ large. New types of music began to develop as well, particularly in cities like New Orleans, as more African Americans being free now, they can move. It's harder to move, but they can move to cities like New Orleans. New elements of black culture, new types of music begin to emerge, like blues music, which evolves out of the music that was sung by enslaved people while they worked, and out of African American spirituals and religious music. And another important area of gain that African Americans made during this period was education. In the Old South, in the antebellum South, especially after the 1830s, it was illegal for enslaved people to learn how to read. It was a very serious offense because there was fear that educated slaves would be more likely to revolt or to rebel against slavery. But after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, African Americans can go to school and they can learn to read, they can learn to write, they can learn valuable skills that will help them bargain for themselves better. And that's a significant gain, even if the schools are segregated and even if African American schools are often underfunded. So now I want to talk about the Plessy v. Ferguson case. I've alluded to this before, and I really want to unpack it because this is a very important topic for American history and for the civic literacy exam in the state of Florida. There will definitely be questions about Plessy v. Ferguson and its legacy, and it's basically the judicial precedent that it set. So in 1890, Homer Plessy was a black man from New Orleans. He was a mixed race person, we would say in our modern language. And in the South, they had what was called the one drop rule, where basically if someone could be found to be even just 1% black, even if they looked white or passed for white, as they would have said in those days, you could still be considered black and you could still be denied the right to vote and denied other rights. So the state of Louisiana was passing Jim Crow laws, including railroad car segregation laws. Now these railroad cars technically are, they're run by private companies. Initially, the railroad companies actually resisted these segregation Jim Crow laws because segregation especially could be very bad for business. You lose customers and it costs you money to provide extra accommodations. You often find actually that business interests will resist elements of the Jim Crow laws and elements of these racist policies that are being passed. As I said, there's weird political alliances that emerge between white Southern planters and Northern labor interests, and between African Americans and Northern, or often Northern business interests in American politics in the 1800s and early 1900s. So, speaking about the Louisiana law specifically, the law said that there had to be equal but separate accommodations on the rail cars, meaning that if there's a white first class car, there has to be a black first class car as well. Even if the white first class car is more expensive and there's fewer African Americans that will ride, it has to be there even if the car is usually empty. The thing, of course, is the railroads don't want to pay for empty cars, so they don't make white first class cars. Ferguson and his African American supporters see this as an opportunity to challenge this discriminatory law. Ferguson will buy a ticket for the white first class car. He was probably 7/8 white, 1/8 black. So if you looked at him, he would look white to you. He buys the car and he is arrested once he's on the car. He declares, "I'm a black man. I have bought a ticket for this car in violation of the law." And then he is arrested. And that was part of the plan. He actually he was supposed to be arrested. This was meant to be a test case. The case goes before Louisiana court. He's sentenced or convicted for violating the law. He appeals his case to the Supreme Court, citing that his 13th and 14th Amendment rights had been violated because he'd been denied accommodations based on his race. His civil rights were not upheld by the state of Louisiana. He had not had the same equal opportunity and equal protection under the law that a white person would have had. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court sided 7-1 with Louisiana. They declared that the 13th Amendment was really just about ending slavery, and they declared the 14th Amendment was not intended to ensure equal protection. It was really just there to not to end racism as much as it was to ensure just very basic equal protection before the law. Basically, what they did was they really narrowed the scope of the 13th and 14th Amendments. They narrowed how the federal government could get involved in state laws if those state laws seemed to be violating the federal law, the Constitution. And basically what the Supreme Court says is that the 13th and 14th Amendments are not being violated as long as separate but equal accommodations were provided. So the Louisiana Rail Company will have to provide a black first-class car, regular coach cars for both white and black customers that are of the same level of quality. Basically, that's what the law says. Separate but equal becomes legal after the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. And the court's decision basically legitimizes segregation. It allows the states to pass Jim Crow laws as long as they can say that separate but equal is being maintained. And this is going to be common until 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education case, which strikes down Plessy versus Ferguson. In practice, though, black accommodations, whether they were rail cars, schools, restrooms, water fountains, they're generally of lower quality. They're not as well made. They're not as well funded in the case of schools, and so in reality, separate but equal hardly ever existed, if at all. And legal scholars will argue that segregation, just by creating segregation, you cannot have separate but equal. And that's really, in many ways, what led to Plessy v. Ferguson being overturned in the 1950s with Brown versus Board. But you'll definitely want to know this if you're a Florida college student who's taking the FCLE. These are some images related to the Jim Crow laws. On the far left side is an image of British actor Charles Matthews. He was known to perform in blackface, often as Hamlet by William Shakespeare. Hamlet was a black or African character, or sometimes a Moorish character, but who often was portrayed by white actors in blackface. In some ways, kind of like how female characters in Shakespeare plays were portrayed by men, perhaps. I don't want to conflate race and gender, though, especially when you're talking about things like segregation. They're two different subjects. It was actually another actor named Thomas Rice, who was a minstrel performer, also in the 1820s, who first performed the song Jump Jim Crow that it was alluded to previously. The center image is a water fountain, a white water fountain, African American or black or colored water fountain, as they would have said during the period. This one is actually from the 1930s in Halifax, North Carolina, in 38 to be exact. And this is from one of the museums that's dedicated towards the Jim Crow laws. So the Jim Crow laws, they are segregation, separation of spaces, something that was not done during the antebellum period, during the time of slavery, because slave owners did not want to be separated from their slaves, from their property. But when black people were no longer slaves, then white people wanted to be separate from them. And also they wanted black people to be subordinate to them. So black people could not vote, they could not serve on juries. Interracial marriages and relationships were banned as well. The black codes did not include those provisions because in some cases white slave owners wanted to have sexual relationships with their female slaves, which was very taboo, yes, but they did not want it to be banned. In fact, some very famous African Americans like Frederick Douglass were mixed race. They had black enslaved mothers and white fathers. In Douglass's case, he believed that his father was his owner, his master, and in the language of the day. And so, when you have laws against African Americans voting, um, in some cases, these can't just be laws that say only white people can vote. They're going to include restrictions that are designed to disenfranchise black people, but in some cases also disenfranchise poor white people as well. Some examples are things like grandfather clauses. If your grandfather was able to vote, you'll be able to vote, which is where we get the term grandfathered in from when the rules are bent from somebody. The term grandfathered in also is a lot older as well. It may also be from English common law, but it's also a reference to the grandfather clause in the Jim Crow South, where if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. Um, Other discriminatory voting laws that were passed as part of the Jim Crow system, they would have things like poll taxes that you had to pay to be able to vote, to be able to go to the polls. A poll tax is technically a type of head tax, which head taxes assigned specifically to individuals. According to the Constitution, they are illegal. They cannot be done. They're unconstitutional. Our definition of what kind of taxes are constitutional, what kind of taxes are not constitutional, has changed with time. But a poll tax that is designed to disenfranchise African Americans or poorer people, I would argue, is definitely an unconstitutional thing. Um, so when these taxes or when these laws are challenged, you'll see that the southern states will change them. They'll make new types of discriminatory laws. They'll also include things like literacy exams, not like the Florida civic literacy exam. These were tests that were applied in a very non-uniform manner and really in a discriminatory manner. In order to vote, they might ask a prospective voter to read a part of the Constitution and then explain its meaning. And a poll worker might see a prospective white voter, ask them to read the preamble, an easy part of the Constitution, and explain its meaning. And then if he gave a good answer, he could be allowed to vote. If he gave a bad answer, maybe he would be denied the right to vote because he did not pass the literacy test. A black person, a black prospective voter, they might go to try to vote or to get onto the voter roll, and the poll worker could ask them to read a very difficult part of the Constitution, a very specific article, and explain its meaning. And if their answer was not sufficient, then they could be denied the right to vote and being on the voter roll. So as you can see, some of these discriminatory laws that were designed primarily to keep black people from voting, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, and then these literacy requirements, they also could keep poor white people from voting as well. And white upper class leaders, they would be challenged on this sometimes, and they would say, well, that's fine if poor white people can't vote. We're okay with that. That's a feature, not a bug. So it's a way in which discrimination against African American people also hurt other groups. In addition to facing the discriminatory Jim Crow laws, African Americans faced violence in the South, not just state-sanctioned and state-sponsored violence, but also violence by vigilantes in the form of lynching. And the lynching cases were actually very controversial. It was something that white Southerners did not like to talk about. And that's where Ida B. Wells comes in. Ida B. Wells was a African American woman. She also had some Native American ancestry as well, but she was from northern Mississippi. She was born and was briefly a slave as a young child, but gained her freedom after the Civil War. After the war, she pursued education as a student and then as a teacher, and she eventually became an investigative journalist. She lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and she studied lynching in the South. She wrote a book called Southern Horror, Lynch Law in All of Its Phases, and the book was very popular. It was a bestseller. It was particularly popular in Europe. And white Southerners, though, did not like the book because it made the South look bad. It reflected poorly on the region, and it also, you could say, debunked some of the narratives that white Southerners had crafted to defend this violence against African Americans. White Southerners, if you'd ask them about lynching, they would say it wasn't very common. They would say that it was being done by vigilantes, ruffians. It was frontier justice. It was not something that the government supported, and that when it was done, it was because black men had allegedly had sexual relations with white women, and that they were just facing mob justice for what they had done. What Wells found was actually quite a bit different. Now, it is true that in some cases, black men accused of having sexual relations or accused of sexually assaulting white women, sometimes they were lynched. But what Wells found was that in many cases, lynching was motivated by economic factors rather than by issues related to race and gender. What they often found was that black people who had found some economic success, they would be targeted and they could be killed. They could be accused of some crime they had not committed, and a mob of people would break them out of jail and kill them. And with lynching, that mob element, being killed in an extrajudicial manner by a mob, the government either not trying to stop you or just letting it happen, that's what makes it a lynching. And people who are lynched, they can be hanged. In some cases, they're shot or burned to death or tortured to death. There has to be a mob element to it where the mob believes that it's dispensing justice. And the majority of the people that were lynched were African Americans. And some had been accused of supposed sexual improprieties or sexual crimes, but others had economic success, and the white population was jealous of them, is what Wells found. And later historians would agree with Wells that economic factors could be at play. They would also argue that if a black person moved into a community and they were not known to the local population, if something bad happened, if someone's horse was stolen, if someone was murdered, everyone would point their fingers at the black person that nobody knew. They might say, this black family over here, I know them. They would not do this sort of thing, but this black man who just moved to town, in violation of anti-vagrancy laws, he must be the guilty party, and then that man could face lynching. And the images on this slide are of Wells herself, the opening page of her investigative book, Southern Horrors, and these are 3 men who were lynched in Georgia. And Wells's work, it brought so much negative attention to her and her family that they actually had to flee Memphis and they moved to Chicago, Illinois. Here are some stats about lynching. People of all races were lynched. There's even evidence of women being lynched as well. I showed an image on a previous slide to illustrate that. But generally speaking, black men were the most likely people to be lynched in the South. The Tuskegee Institute estimates that over 4,700 people were lynched from the 1880s to the 1960s. Over 3,400 of them were African Americans, and nearly 1,300 of them were white. And a large percentage of those whites that were lynched would have been Italians or immigrants, because Italians and immigrants, especially immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, were not considered white in the same way that they are today. And the majority of the lynchings that happen in this period from the 1880s to the 1960s take place in the South. I suspect this is a estimate that's on the lower side. They might only be including people who were hanged to death by a mob. As I said, you could be lynched and killed in other manners. The biggest thing that makes a murder a lynching is when it's being done by a mob of people who believe the person that they are killing is accused of a crime, and they're not giving that person a fair trial, or as fair of a trial as they could get in the Jim Crow South. And on the next slide, I'm going to show some images of where these lynchings are happening the most in the country and when. If you look closely at this map, you'll see that every dot on the map represents a person that was lynched. This light orange color is black people that are lynched. You can see the most lynchings take place in what we think of as the South, the Deep South, and sort of the Appalachian South as well. You'll notice there's not quite as many lynchings in the Appalachian South. There's just a lower black population there. But you'll notice there's quite a few lynchings that take place in urban areas too, as black people are moving into these urban centers like Atlanta, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, like New Orleans. They're going to be, if they're unknown to the local community, they're much more likely to be accused of crimes if a crime is committed. There are lynchings of other racial groups and ethnic groups as well. You can see blue dots represent Italians. You see lynchings of Italians in the South, but also in the Northeast as well, where there are large Italian populations. Out west, you see evidence of lynching as well. Chinese people being lynched here with these red dots. Chinese people were working on railroad projects and things like that in the American West, and they were discriminated against. And actually, after the 1880s, they were banned from entering the United States. They're going to be banned until World War II for about 60 years. Other groups that are lynched as well, Native Americans you can see in pink, and then Mexican American people, Latino people, especially in the Southwest, are in this kind of light orange color. And if you look at this bottom bar here, apologies for the text, this is actually still from a earlier video I did on this subject. You'll notice that lynchings pick up during and right around the time of presidential elections. So even if crowds of people believed that they were dispensing justice on people who had committed crimes, supposedly, there often was a political element. Lynchings would take place as part of race riots, as a part of political intimidation. So political intimidation is not just happening in the Reconstruction era with the KKK, it's happening even in the 20th century. You can see there's a marked increase in lynchings in 1919 when there were some very serious race riots in America. This is Booker T. Washington on the left and W.E.B. Du Bois on the right. They're two very important African American civil rights activists and leaders in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They're advocating for African American people, just like Ida B. Wells was during this period. A bit about the both of them. Booker T. Washington was born in 1856 in the South in Virginia. He was born a slave but gained his freedom after the Civil War. He attended an HBC, he sought education, and then he went on to found the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a very important African American educational institution and really intellectual hub. Other civil rights leaders and African American leaders and scientists and thinkers spent time at Tuskegee. George Washington Carver, the scientist, for example, was at Tuskegee for many years. And for his activism, Washington took the approach called racial uplift. He advocated that African Americans build their businesses, pursue jobs, pursue education, make money, buy land, work together as a community and to better themselves. And in doing so, they could prove to white society that they deserved freedom and equality and equal rights with whites. And Booker T. Washington's message and who he was as a person resonated with many African Americans. Cast down your bucket where you are, Booker T. Washington said. Don't leave the South. Stay where you're located. Work together with your African American neighbors to have a better life. And by working together through teamwork, we can make things better for our people. This message resonated with many African Americans who named things after Booker T. Washington, and many whites respected and were interested in what Washington had to say as well, to the point that Booker T. Washington was getting invited to the White House to meet with President Teddy Roosevelt. The other very important African American activist that I want you to know about in this period is W.E.B. Du Bois, who's seen on the right. Unlike Washington, who was born as a slave in the South, Du Bois was from the North and then sought education in the South. Eventually, though, he went to Harvard University and got a PhD. He's really considered to be one of the greatest African American intellectuals and thinkers of all time, and really one of America's greatest academics overall. He is an important historian and sociologist. His works on Reconstruction, on African American culture, are still a must-read today. But Du Bois's approach to activism was different than Washington's. Washington advocated for racial uplift. He advocated for African Americans working together to make money, to better themselves, and then to prove that they deserved equality to white Americans. Du Bois, his approach was much more political activism first, equality first, and then African Americans could build wealth and build their communities. And the two men initially worked together, but over time they diverged, especially after 1895. In 1895, Booker T. Washington met with white Southern or white supremacist leaders in Atlanta, Georgia, in what was called the Atlanta Compromise. And in Atlanta in 1895, Washington said that he would not challenge the Jim Crow laws, these discriminatory laws in the South. In exchange, white political leaders would do more to protect African Americans from lynchings and other violence. They would do more to make sure that African Americans had due process when they were put on trial, and that there would be more funding for African American academic institutions like Tuskegee, for example. So that was seen as being a bad compromise by many, especially Du Bois, and the two over time diverged, with Du Bois focusing more on direct political action as opposed to the racial uplift of Booker T. Washington. Also, Booker T. Washington did not really want African Americans to leave the South in large numbers. He wanted them to stay in the South and work together to better life for African Americans in the South. Du Bois spent a lot of time outside of the South in the North as well. And after 1915, when Booker T. Washington passed away, Du Bois's type of activism really became the dominant form of African American civil rights advocacy. Racial uplift didn't go away completely, but the more political approach advocated by Du Bois became more the mainstream. A couple of other things about Du Bois. He was a published author. He wrote books about Reconstruction, about African American culture and people. He was a historian and a sociologist. All of that stuff is very interesting and very positive. Some of Du Bois's other ideas have not aged quite as well. Du Bois believed that over time America would become more socialistic as the American economy developed, as it became more industrial and technological. He believed that socialism was more of an inevitability, which was not what happened. And a lot of academics believed this, though, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Also, Du Bois had made some rather laudatory comments about 1930s Germany and the German people, the German Volk. He also talked about how there, in some ways, was more democracy in 1930s Germany than there was in the Jim Crow South. People have argued that meant he was a supporter of 1930s German politics. It's not really the whole story, and I will say that those remarks, well, they have not aged well. As World War II began, as what was happening in Germany became revealed, Du Bois became a big supporter of the U.S. war effort against Germany in World War II. He also supported America in World War I as well. He saw these wars as an opportunity for African Americans to fight for freedom and to prove that they deserved equality. African Americans are advocating for social change. They're advocating for resistance to the Jim Crow laws, challenging the Jim Crow laws. White Americans are also responding to the social change of the Reconstruction period and afterward, and they're responding in a very different way. White Americans, especially white Southerners, unfortunately, are embracing white supremacy. The elite classes who own the plantations, who manage the factories, they wanted to keep poor white people and black people from uniting together. Populists, they tried in the South to unite poor whites and black people. It largely did not work, at least not on a state or federal level. Sometimes the populists would do well in like local elections, but populism, unfortunately, was a non-starter in the South. Instead, white people in the South supported the Solid South, the idea that all white people should support the Democratic Party regardless of class. They should vote as a race, not as a class. And one ideology that helped to make the Solid South possible, this white supremacist system possible, is the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause really is a form of propaganda that was developed shortly after the Civil War in 1866 to provide a mythology for the Civil War and to unite white Southerners. It was developed by a guy named Edward Pollard and advocated by many other people, especially Confederate veterans. Many Confederate veterans supported the Lost Cause. Not all. James Longstreet, for example, who I previously mentioned, was very critical of the Lost Cause. But according to the Lost Cause mythology or the Lost Cause propaganda, the South, the Confederacy, they lost the Civil War not because their cause was worse than the Union's cause or because they were fighting for slavery. They lost the war because they were not as industrialized, they were smaller, they didn't have as many people as the North. Their society was more old-fashioned, it was more like the knights and lords and cavaliers of Europe, whereas the North was more like Puritans and industrialists and Yankee engineers who were able to overcome the South because they were more powerful and industrial. The Lost Cause also holds that slavery was not really a motivating factor for fighting the Civil War, that other issues like states' rights or cultural differences, the Cavalier Southerners against the Puritan Yankees, that was what motivated the Civil War, which I don't agree with. There were some major cultural differences between Northerners and Southerners, and even between different types of Northerners, the Yankees of New England versus Midwesterners, and then Appalachian Southerners versus Deep South Southerners. There were differences between the North and the South, and then differences between Southerners and Northerners, but I don't think cultural influences were enough to motivate a civil war. And on a more personal note, my advisor, my dissertation advisor, Joan Cash, and her advisor was a guy named David Donald from Harvard University. And David Donald, he's, I guess, sort of my grand advisor, you could say. He said that fundamentally Northerners and Southerners were the same people. There may have been differences, but at the end of the day, they were more similar than they were different. So I don't think cultural factors alone could have motivated the Civil War. I don't think states' rights factors alone could have motivated the Civil War. The biggest states' rights issue were issues related to slavery. So to say that the Civil War was not about slavery, as many Lost Cause proponents do, is simply not the whole story. That being said, though, the best kinds of propaganda, they mix truth with falsehood. It is true that the South was less industrial. It is true that there were some cultural differences between people in the North and people in the South. They would just rather say that slavery was not a motivating factor. And some will even say that, slavery was really not that bad of a system. It was better than Northern capitalism. Masters treated their slave owners well in a paternalistic manner, which is really not true either. But the ideology, it appeals to aging Confederate veterans who don't want to think about why the Civil War was fought and why the war was lost. But it also appeals to a lot of young white people in the South who don't remember the Civil War, people like Henry Grady. It also appeals to a lot of young white people in the North who they want to find an explanation for why the Civil War happened. And the Lost Cause's condemnation of Northern industrial interests, that really is going to resonate in the Gilded Age with white Northerners that are upset at the big business leaders like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. According to the Lost Cause, big business people in the North, they were the ones that caused the Civil War. They were the bad guys. So there's class elements as well as race elements to the Lost Cause. It's a racial ideology, but a class-based ideology as well. And you really see this out west. A lot of the Western bandits and outlaws, people like the James brothers, they were former Confederate veterans, and a lot of the people who defended these Western outlaws were defending former Confederates as well. And lastly, believe it or not, the ideology does have some appeal with Union veterans. Union veterans, especially after the 1880s, they're getting older. They want to have reconciliation with their former enemies, the Confederate veterans. They want to make bygones be bygones and forget why the war really happened. Not all Union veterans, but many Union veterans. And in many cases, the U.S. government encourages the Lost Cause because they want to promote unity and brotherhood between the South and the North. That way the country can then focus on other external problems, namely things like building an American empire in the Spanish-American War, getting Southerners to join the military during World War I. So there's a class and a race element to the Lost Cause, but the Lost Cause, believe it or not, is supported in many cases by the U.S. government. And today, the Lost Cause is still popular with some people. And again, if the Lost Cause were completely false, completely fabricated, no shred of truth at all, it wouldn't have caught on. But because they've mixed truth and falsehood together, it makes it difficult to dismiss the Lost Cause, and that's why it still has some resonation with people in the present-day United States. Again, the shreds of truth, the grains of truth in the midst of the falsehoods, the South was devastated by the Civil War. The major economic centers were greatly damaged. Cities were burned. Factories, what factories that there were destroyed. Railroads were melted down. plantations were abandoned and lost. The haunted house trope that we have in America, it actually kind of comes out of the post-Civil War South as big plantation houses were abandoned because the labor force that kept them going has moved on, has fled. So again, there's elements of truth mixed into this mythology of falsehoods. And of course, many white Southerners were very angry that they'd lost the war. They were angry that African Americans had fought against them, that they had been defeated by a Union army that had black soldiers enlisted, and they were angry that slavery had come to an end, even if they themselves were not slave owners. And the majority of white Southerners were not slave owners. In a previous video on the Civil War, I've broken down what percentage of white Southerners actually owned slaves and benefited from slavery. Again, evidence of the lost cause. There are literature like The Lost Cause written by Edward Pollard in 1866. Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind, had a very charitable portrayal of slavery and of the South. The movie Gone with the Wind portrays Margaret Mitchell's novel, and I actually think the movie is very interesting and complex. It came out in the 1930s. I don't support The Lost Cause, but the movie from the 30s shows how people interpreted the novel and how they remembered the South, how white Americans chose to remember the South. And Gone with the Wind went on to become, by some estimates, one of the most popular movies of all time, one of the highest grossing movies of all time. So clearly it was resonating with people. There's art related to The Lost Cause. This is a Henry Mosler painting of a Confederate soldier coming home to his cabin that's been abandoned and destroyed by the war. Many parts of the southern countryside, not the entirety of the South, but the most economically productive parts of the South, were devastated by the Union Army and by the Confederate Army as well, that had to take supplies from the countryside. By the way, Mosler was a German-Jewish immigrant artist, and he was a supporter of the Union, but he did make some artwork that's associated with the Lost Cause. This is the Stone Mountain relief. It's in Georgia, outside of Atlanta. It's sometimes called the Mount Rushmore of the Confederacy because it features President Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, two of the most famous Confederate officers. And Confederate monuments were erected in the late 1800s, early 1900s, often with lost cause descriptions and epigraphs, which is why some people argue that Confederate monuments ought to be taken down or moved out of the public view. It's a complex subject. Without getting into my own beliefs as much, I tend to think that we don't want to, in an attempt to correct the historical record, we don't want to possibly erase history. That's all I'll say on that more recent and controversial subject. And here are Confederate veterans and Union veterans shaking hands. They organized veterans reconciliation events and even reenactments where veterans would meet at places like Gettysburg, where famous battles were fought. They would talk together, have a meal together. Pickett's Charge would be reenacted by the veterans that were still healthy enough to walk Pickett's Charge. And this was done to promote reconciliation between the North and the South. This was something that was especially important to President Woodrow Wilson, a white Southerner and a Democrat who wanted the North and the South to be united. That way America could better deal with external problems, like, say, the First World War. Conclusion. To wrap things up, there are significant breaks and commonalities with the past in the post-Reconstruction South. The significant breaks or differences with the past is in the post-Reconstruction South, often known as the New South or the Gilded Age South, the region is becoming more industrial. There are more railroads, there are more factories, there are new industries as well, steel, even things like oil out west. The economy is more diverse, and there are new opportunities for Southern laborers, especially for African Americans who are now free, who are no longer slaves. New freedoms and new opportunities develop, particularly in these wage-earning jobs, which can be steadier and can be provide more upward mobility than things like sharecropping. There are, however, some commonalities. Many of the old power structures remain. The antebellum slavery era power structures remain, even though slavery has been abolished. white supremacist political and social systems, laws on the books, the Jim Crow laws, racist customs that keep black people subordinated to white people, the Solid South, the idea that white people should all vote for the Democratic Party and they should vote as a race rather than as a class, because in many ways African Americans had, or poor white people had more in common with African Americans than they did with the white upper class. Those are old power structures that will remain in the post-Reconstruction and Gilded Age era South. And the U.S. government is going to step away from enforcing the federal law to protect African American rights, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Federal power is going to be greatly restricted and constrained by Supreme Court cases, especially Plessy v. Ferguson, which allows for segregation or separate but equal. So even as the South is changing, many things are staying the same. And I want to emphasize that because some people often think erroneously that perhaps things were actually better in the antebellum South for African Americans, that slavery wasn't as bad as industrial capitalism that was catching on in the post-Reconstruction South. This is actually kind of a lost cause idea, that some people believe that slavery was not so bad, industrial capitalism was worse. I don't believe this, and most historians don't believe this, but sometimes it gets brought up in the lost cause. I don't want what I'm saying to be misunderstood. The images on these slides are related to politics and culture during the period. Restrooms, white and African American, are colored as they would have said in the period. And when I talk about segregation in this video, I've been speaking about separate accommodations in terms of race. I'm not talking about gender here. That's a whole different subject that might come up in a later video, but not bringing it up here. This is a theater ticket. It's for an African American balcony. Again, even movie theaters and sporting events could be segregated in the South. And this is a poll tax from 1918. It's from Louisiana. It's $1, which, adjusting for inflation, that would be like $14 or $15 in today's money. Although really it would have the feel or the purchasing power of like $100 or $120. So again, evidence of the Jim Crow laws and system that we talked about today in this video.